Jamal adjusted his tie and took a deep breath as he stepped into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Ashwood Enterprises. Today was another day, one he'd prepared for with quiet resolve. He had been with the company for over 5 years, rising through the ranks from an intern to his current role as senior analyst, driven by a work ethic that could not be shaken. But despite his accomplishments and dedication, Jamal often felt invisible in the place he worked so hard to support. The steady buzz of conversation drifted around him as he made his way to his cubicle, nodding politely to a few colleagues who responded with brief, dismissive nods. But his boss, Mr. Harding, made no such gestures. In fact, the only time Mr. Harding acknowledged Jamal was when he found something to criticize. His sharp, scrutinizing eyes would narrow as he found flaws in Jamal's reports or made backhanded comments about his effort to keep up. The disrespect ran deep, and it wasn't lost on Jamal. Jamal knew why his boss singled him out. Mr. Harding barely hid his disdain. Where he smiled at other employees, his eyes always turned cold when they landed on Jamal. And while Jamal tried to give his best, Mr. Harding never seemed to be satisfied. This treatment was especially painful, as Jamal knew something the others didn't. In a twist of fate, his late uncle, an investor with a substantial stake in Ashwood Enterprises, had left Jamal his shares, with a quiet stipulation that he would one day take his rightful place among the decision makers. This legacy had been kept secret, a condition his uncle insisted on. Jamal, however, knew the day would come when he would reveal his inheritance and ultimately his position within the company. As he settled at his desk, he overheard snippets of laughter and light conversation among his colleagues. Jamal had a moment of doubt, wondering if he was doing the right thing by keeping the inheritance secret, but he quickly shook it off. His uncle had given him this legacy as a gift and a challenge. The words his uncle had shared echoed in his mind. Someday they'll have to see your worth, Jamal. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you are. Lost in thought, he hardly noticed Mr. Harding striding across the room. The boss's abrupt voice pulled him back to the present. Jamal. Mr. Harding's tone dripped with impatience. I hope you're ready for that presentation. Make sure it's flawless. We don't want any mistakes tarnishing our image, do we? Jamal looked up, nodding silently as he fought back the familiar sting of resentment. He glanced at the company's logo, a gleaming emblem mounted proudly on the wall. Soon he thought everything would change. And when it did, he'd be ready. Jamal settled into his usual routine, pulling up files, refining data, and preparing his upcoming report for the board meeting. His days were spent deep in analytics, providing insights that allowed Ashwood Enterprises to make critical business decisions. Yet, despite his impact, he received little recognition. It didn't take long for Mr. Harding to swoop by, his usual smug expression intact. Jamal, I need you to run these numbers again, he said, dropping a thick pile of papers onto Jamal's desk. I noticed some discrepancies. Jamal scanned the documents, and within seconds, he realized that there were no errors. He had been thorough. I double-checked these figures myself, Mr. Harding, he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. I'm confident they're correct. Mr. Harding's mouth twisted into a smirk. Well, I don't need you to be confident, Jamal. I need you to be competent. Just redo it, he snapped, striding away without waiting for a response. Jamal clenched his jaw but turned back to his computer, beginning the task all over again. He knew there was nothing to fix, yet he would comply. His resilience had seen him through before. As the weeks passed, Mr. Harding's behavior became more overtly dismissive. He would critique Jamal's work in front of the team, magnifying any minor error while ignoring his successes. During meetings, he rarely allowed Jamal to finish his points, cutting him off with curt interruptions like, "We'll discuss that later," or "That's irrelevant to the core issue." The team watched these interactions, casting sideways glances, but no one spoke up. Jamal could feel the weight of each belittling comment, yet he bit back his frustration. He knew he was capable and deserving of respect. His uncle's memory reminded him of his purpose, to endure, to prove that he was worthy, not just to others but to himself. He quietly reminded himself that his day would come. One afternoon, as the deadline for a major project loomed, Mr. Harding called Jamal into his office. He was sitting with a smirk, leaning back in his leather chair. "Jamal, I'm handing you the responsibility of updating the records from our last quarter." Jamal's brow furrowed. Updating records was work typically assigned to interns, not senior analysts. "Sir, I thought my focus was on the client analytics for the board review," he replied, trying to remain calm. "Oh, don't worry about that," Mr. Harding said, waving his hand dismissively. "I'll have someone else handle it. Just focus on what I've given you." The insinuation was clear. Mr. Harding didn't think Jamal could handle the more high-level work. Jamal's patience was stretched thin, but he kept his face impassive and nodded. "Understood, Mr. Harding. I'll have it completed by end of day." As he left the office, he could feel the stares of his colleagues following him, pity and discomfort in their expressions. Jamal felt the heat rise in his face, a mixture of frustration and helplessness. He was overqualified for the task but took it on without complaint. His resolve to stay calm and composed outweighed his anger. He would fulfill the task, proving he could rise above the pettiness. Days passed, each one bringing a new way for Mr. Harding to test his patience. When Jamal finished updating the records, his boss assigned him a stack of low-priority paperwork, the kind that barely required analysis. Meanwhile, his colleagues were given presentations and client calls. The message was unmistakable. Jamal was being pushed aside. One evening, while packing up, Jamal overheard Mr. Harding talking to a colleague near the break room. "Jamal? Oh, he's not exactly top tier, you know. Just good for running reports and numbers. I keep him on the easy stuff," Mr. Harding sneered. "Can't risk him messing up anything important." The words cut through Jamal, but he stayed hidden, fists clenched as he listened. Jamal knew he could escalate this to human resources, that his treatment was unfair. But he also knew that Mr. Harding's influence in the company was strong. Jamal felt trapped, watching as other employees received promotions and praise while he was sidelined. His colleagues would occasionally offer a sympathetic nod or a forced smile, but no one dared to intervene. Despite everything, he kept his head down and his heart steady, pouring himself into his work. Each menial task was tackled with meticulous care. Each condescending comment was met with respectful silence. This quiet resilience defined him, and he knew it was his strength. Yet, there were moments of vulnerability late at night when he was the only one left in the office, staying behind to redo reports, work overtime, or proof data that others left incomplete. Those moments tested him. He wondered if his uncle's inheritance was worth this constant barrage of disrespect. One Friday afternoon, a surprise email popped up in his inbox. The subject line read, "Board meeting invitation." He blinked, wondering if it was a mistake. No one in his position would typically attend a board meeting. But as he read the details, he noticed a name in the CC line that made him pause. Martin Ashwood, the CEO and founder of Ashwood Enterprises. Jamal's mind raced. The email had been addressed to him directly, confirming his attendance at the upcoming meeting. He glanced up, catching Mr. Harding's eye from across the office. His boss looked at him with a strange expression, one that betrayed a flicker of annoyance and perhaps even fear. In that moment, Jamal felt something shift. His resolve hardened. This invitation was more than a meeting request. It was the beginning of a long overdue change. The board meeting was a day away, and Jamal felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. This could be his chance to present his insights directly to the people who could make a difference. He knew the stakes, but he was ready. The invitation had reinvigorated him, a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark workplace. But as he prepped his materials late into the night, Mr. Harding's footsteps echoed through the near-empty office. Jamal looked up to see him approaching, his face twisted in a look of irritation. "Jamal." "A word," Mr. Harding said curtly, gesturing toward his office. Jamal gathered his things, feeling the familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach, and followed him inside. The door clicked shut, and Mr. Harding turned to face him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "I noticed an error in one of your reports from last week," he began, his tone dripping with forced patience. "A rather critical one, actually. Care to explain?" Jamal's brow furrowed. "An error, sir? I've been thorough with each report and even cross-referenced it multiple times. Are you implying I'm lying?" Mr. Harding's voice rose slightly, his eyes flashing with something darker. "Because the last thing I need in this department is someone who can't own up to their mistakes." Jamal took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm not saying that, sir. I'd be happy to review the report with you to see what went wrong. See, that's your problem, Jamal, Mr. Harding sneered, his voice tinged with barely concealed contempt. You think you're too good to take feedback. You come in here every day, acting like you deserve a seat at the table. But let's be real, you're just a senior analyst, nothing more. The words stung, but Jamal remained composed. I've always tried to give my best to this company, sir. Mr. Harding laughed, a hollow sound that sent a chill through the room. Well, your best isn't good enough, he snapped. In fact, I think we're done here. This company can't afford the risk of having someone who refuses to learn, who's difficult to work with. Consider this your last day, Jamal. Clear out your desk. The weight of the words hit Jamal like a punch to the chest. Fired. After years of hard work, after countless overtime hours and swallowing endless insults, it had come to this. The unfairness of it all burned in his throat, a mix of anger, disbelief, and deep-seated pain. He knew Mr. Harding's words were a thinly veiled excuse, hiding a resentment that had nothing to do with his performance. Jamal swallowed, his fist clenched. Is this really about my work, Mr. Harding? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harding's eyes flashed with a dangerous glint. Take it however you want, Jamal. But remember, there are plenty of other people out there who know how to fit in better than you. You can clear out your desk or I'll have security do it for you. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken words. Jamal knew there was no reasoning with Mr. Harding, no argument that would change his mind. This wasn't about performance, it was about power, control, and the boss's simmering prejudice. Jamal could see the satisfaction in Mr. Harding's eyes as he held the door open, eager to rid himself of what he saw as a problem. Fine, Jamal said, his voice tight but calm. I'll clear out my desk. He stepped out of the office, every movement slow and deliberate. His mind raced with questions, each one tightening the knot in his chest. What would he do now? How could he leave behind the career he'd built with such determination? As he packed his belongings, his colleagues glanced over, their faces a mix of shock, pity, and guilt. No one approached him, no one offered words of support. The weight of the silence, the feeling of isolation, pressed down on him. And yet, amidst the hurt and anger, there was something else, an unspoken promise, a reminder that this wasn't the end. His uncle's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reassurance that his worth went beyond any title or role Mr. Harding could take from him. Jamal took one last look around the office, then walked toward the exit, his head held high, despite the storm of emotions raging within him. As he left, he felt the unresolved tension hang heavy in the air, as though the walls themselves held secrets waiting to surface. The echo of his footsteps seemed to signal not an end, but a beginning. And he knew that soon, the world he was leaving would feel the impact of what was yet to come. Days passed since Jamal had packed his belongings and left Ashwood Enterprises, the weight of Mr. Harding's dismissal heavy on his shoulders. But beneath the pain and frustration simmered a quiet determination. Jamal had been planning for this moment, knowing it would come sooner or later. That evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone rang. It was Martin Ashwood, the company's founder and CEO, and the only one who knew the truth about Jamal's inheritance. Jamal Martin's voice was warm, a contrast to the tense days Jamal had endured. It's time we make things right. Are you ready to return? Jamal didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Let's do this. The following week, Martin and Jamal's legal team coordinated a meeting for the board members and key staff. They were informed of a significant change in leadership that would affect the future of Ashwood Enterprises. Mr. Harding had received a vague email about the meeting but brushed it off, convinced it was routine. He had already moved on from Jamal, treating the dismissal as a minor inconvenience in his world of control. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jamal walked into the Ashwood boardroom with Martin Ashwood by his side. The air felt thick with anticipation as board members whispered among themselves, glancing curiously at Jamal, who wore a confident expression. He could feel their eyes on him, trying to piece together why the former senior analyst had returned. Mr. Harding entered, glancing at Jamal with a hint of surprise that quickly turned to disdain. He crossed his arms, shooting a smug look as if to say, "Why are you here?" But his confidence faltered when he noticed Jamal was seated at the table, not standing to the side. Harding's smirk faded, replaced by a hint of nervousness. Martin cleared his throat, calling the room to order. "Thank you all for being here today. This is a momentous occasion for Ashwood Enterprises," he began, his tone solemn but with a note of excitement. "Many of you may not know this, but Ashwood Enterprises was built on values of equality, respect, and integrity, values my brother believed in deeply. And today we honor his legacy." A murmur swept through the room as Martin spoke. Mr. Harding shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the gravity of Martin's words. "Today we officially welcome a new addition to the Ashwood leadership team. This person embodies the values upon which this company was built, and his connection to our legacy runs deep," Martin continued. "It's my pleasure to introduce our new vice president and part owner of Ashwood Enterprises, Jamal Ashwood." A wave of shock rolled through the room, rippling across every face. The board members exchanged startled glances. The executives shifted in their seats, and Mr. Harding's mouth dropped open, his expression a mixture of confusion and horror. Part owner Harding's voice came out as a strangled whisper, his face paling. Martin nodded, his gaze sharp. "Yes, Mr. Harding. Jamal is not only my nephew but also my brother's chosen heir to his shares in Ashwood Enterprises. He has quietly held an ownership stake in this company for years. He may have been your senior analyst, but in truth, Jamal has always been a significant part of this company." Jamal looked across the room, meeting each pair of stunned eyes before finally settling on Mr. Harding, who looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. For the first time in his life, Jamal saw a flicker of fear in the man who had so arrogantly dismissed him just days ago. You're an Ashwood," Harding stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Harding," Jamal said calmly, his voice steady. "And I've been entrusted with a responsibility to this company that goes beyond any job title or position. I had hoped to fulfill this role with integrity and humility, but recent events have made it necessary to clarify my role here." The room was silent, the tension thick as Harding struggled to process what he was hearing. His face twisted into a mix of rage and desperation as he sputtered, You think you can just walk in here and take over? After all I've worked for." Jamal's gaze hardened, his calm demeanor belying the fire in his eyes. "Mr. Harding, I don't need to walk in and take over anything. I already have a stake in this company, a stake I've earned through my family's legacy and my own work. You made the choice to dismiss me under false pretenses, to belittle my work and question my integrity. But it seems you didn't know the whole story." Harding's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching as he attempted to regain control. "This is absurd," he blurted out. You don't have the experience for this. The board will never agree to this arrangement." Martin's voice cut through the air, sharp and decisive. "I am the board, Mr. Harding, and I fully endorse Jamal's role. I trust him with this company's future more than I trust you." Harding's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling. He looked around the room, desperate for support, but found only uneasy expressions. The board members were no longer on his side. In that moment he realized that he was alone. Martin continued, "We've reviewed your recent actions, Mr. Harding, and it's clear that your conduct toward Jamal was not only unprofessional but prejudiced. Your pattern of belittling, undermining, and finally dismissing him has no place here. Ashwood Enterprises has always been about fostering talent, and we cannot tolerate this behavior." Jamal took a deep breath, the weight of his uncle's legacy grounding him, as he addressed the room. "I have worked here for years, often overlooked, often questioned, but I remained because I believed in the values that Ashwood Enterprises stood for. I believed in the vision my uncle had for this company, and while my path here wasn't easy, it has taught me resilience and the importance of standing by one's values. He turned to Mr. Harding, his voice unwavering. You, on the other hand, have shown nothing but contempt for those you think are beneath you. You dismissed me, not because of my performance, but because you couldn't see past your own bias. That's not leadership, that's cowardice. Harding's face turned red as he struggled for words, but Jamal continued, his voice calm and steady. You may have thought you were in control, Mr. Harding, but you were wrong. You lost sight of what truly matters, and now you're facing the consequences of those actions. Martin leaned forward, addressing the room. Effective immediately, Jamal will take over Mr. Harding's responsibilities. We'll be making adjustments to ensure a workplace that aligns with our company's mission of respect and equality. Mr. Harding, you're relieved of your duties and security will escort you to collect your belongings. Harding looked as though he'd been physically struck, his face paling as the reality of his situation sank in. He stood, his shoulders slumped, and without another word, made his way to the door, his pride and arrogance shattered. As Harding left, Jamal felt a sense of closure, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He looked around the room, the faces of the board members now filled with respect and admiration. He hadn't needed to prove himself through titles or power. He had earned this moment by staying true to his principles. Martin smiled at him, a look of pride in his eyes. Jamal, this is the beginning of something great. I know you'll lead with the same integrity and dedication that brought you here today. Jamal nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it head-on. As he looked around the boardroom, he felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. He was no longer an outsider, he was an Ashwood, and he was here to make a difference. Jamal took a deep breath as he walked through the familiar glass doors of Ashwood Enterprises, this time as a vice president and part owner. The subtle glances from employees, the hushed whispers that followed him, everything felt different, but in a way that he had prepared himself for. Today he was not just another face in the crowd, but a leader, entrusted with the responsibility to make changes that reflected the true values of his family's company. As he made his way to the top-floor conference room, he noticed the shift in demeanor from his colleagues. Where once there had been dismissive nods or indifferent glances, there were now looks of respect and curiosity. They knew, at last, that he was here to make a difference. He paused at the door of his office, a spacious room that overlooked the city skyline. Just a week ago, this office had belonged to Mr. Harding. Jamal took a moment to savor the view, feeling the significance of his new role sink in. He was no longer an overlooked employee working in the shadows. He had a voice and the authority to make the changes he had envisioned. Jamal's first meeting was with the senior staff. As he entered the boardroom, the room fell silent. His presence carried a weight it hadn't before, and his colleagues leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. Good morning, everyone, Jamal began, his voice calm but strong. As some of you know, I'm stepping into a new role here at Ashwood Enterprises. And with this new role, I intend to make some important changes that honor the values on which this company was built. The room remained silent, each person hanging on his words. Jamal continued, for too long, we have allowed certain behaviors to go unchecked. Disrespect, bias, and exclusion have no place within these walls. Going forward, we will be implementing new policies to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. A murmur of approval spread through the room. Jamal noticed a few nods from his colleagues, people who had perhaps experienced their own quiet battles in the company. He could see the hope in their faces, the relief that someone was finally addressing what had long been ignored. Just as he was outlining the new policies, the door swung open and Mr. Harding entered, looking disheveled and visibly angry. He hadn't been able to reconcile himself with his removal from power and had come to challenge Jamal's authority. Jamal Harding sneered, a bitter edge to his voice. I suppose I should call you Mr. Ashwood now. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room as if looking for allies. I won't stand by while you turn this place upside down with your so-called values. I built this department, and I won't watch it be dismantled by someone who doesn't understand how things work here. The room tensed as everyone turned to look at Jamal, waiting for his response. Jamal met Harding's gaze, calm but resolute. "Mr. Harding, your behavior has been part of the problem," he said, his voice steady. "This company was founded on principles of respect and inclusion, principles you chose to ignore. For years you dismissed others, belittled them, and refused to give people a fair chance. That ends now." Harding scoffed, attempting a confident facade. "You think you're better than me? Just because you happen to be an Ashwood doesn't mean you know what's best for this place. I was here long before you ever stepped foot in this building, and I know how things are done." Jamal remained unfazed, his gaze unwavering. "Knowing how things are done doesn't mean they're done right. I've spent years watching you treat people with disrespect, myself included. You reduced employees to cogs in a machine, undermining their contributions and devaluing their efforts. That behavior won't be tolerated here anymore. I won't allow it." A hush fell over the room, and Harding's face twisted in frustration. He turned to the rest of the senior staff, as if looking for someone to back him up. But instead of the support he had expected, he found only silent faces, eyes lowered or focused on Jamal. They had seen Harding's true nature, and for the first time they felt empowered to stand by someone willing to confront it. With a bitter laugh, Harding straightened, attempting to regain his composure. "Fine," he said, voice tinged with defeat. "But don't think for a second that these people respect you. They're only following orders. You'll never have the loyalty I commanded here." Jamal shook his head. "Respect is earned, Mr. Harding, and it isn't won through intimidation or fear. I'm here to lead, not to command. If you had shown even a fraction of the respect you expected from others, maybe things would be different for you today." At that, Harding looked away, his bravado slipping as he sensed the finality of Jamal's words. He knew that his time at Ashwood was over, and with it, the toxic influence he had once wielded. Defeated, he turned on his heel and left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. As the door closed behind Harding, Jamal took a steadying breath and looked around the room. The tension had lifted, replaced with a feeling of relief and quiet respect. He knew that his journey was just beginning, and that real change would take time, but this moment marked a powerful start. Jamal turned back to the senior staff, his voice carrying warmth and resolve. "Ashwood is a place for everyone who brings their best, regardless of background or title. Let's build a company where every person feels valued, where diversity is our strength, and where we hold ourselves accountable to the highest standards." The room erupted in applause, a genuine show of support for the new leader who had risen not through intimidation but through integrity. Jamal felt a surge of pride and gratitude, knowing he had not only upheld his uncle's legacy, but had begun to create one of his own. As the meeting concluded, his colleagues approached him one by one, congratulating him and expressing their excitement for the changes he had promised. They shook his hand, their respect no longer forced but earned. That evening, as Jamal looked out over the city from his new office, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had faced prejudice and adversity, yet he had risen above it, not only for himself but for those who would come after him. The company would thrive under his leadership, and he would make sure it was a place where every person, regardless of their background, could find a home. For the first time, Jamal felt at peace, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a warm glow over the city, Jamal took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The last few weeks had tested him, pushing him to the edge and challenging his sense of self-worth. But through the adversity, he had emerged stronger, more determined, and deeply aware of the power of resilience. Sitting in his office, he thought back to the countless moments when he had doubted himself, wondered if his quiet endurance had been enough, or if he should have spoken out sooner. But now he understood that there was strength in holding firm, in staying true to one's values even in the face of injustice. It wasn't just about enduring the hardships, it was about transforming them, about finding purpose in pain and using it to fuel change. Jamal knew that his journey was far from over. Ashwood Enterprises was a microcosm of the world at large, a place where prejudice could take root if left unchecked. His role now was not only to lead but to ensure that every voice was valued, and that every person who walked through those doors was treated with the respect they deserved. The small actions, the policies, the words of encouragement, the moments of accountability were the foundation of lasting change. He was ready to do his part to make Ashwood a place where others could grow and thrive, free from the biases that had once limited him. But Jamal's journey was not just about his own redemption or success. It was about every person who had faced dismissal or belittlement, every person who had been overlooked because of someone else's prejudice. His experience was a reminder of how important it is to cultivate workplaces where dignity and fairness are cornerstones, where everyone can bring their full selves without fear of being judged or diminished. Looking out over the city, Jamal felt a surge of purpose, knowing he had an opportunity to create a ripple effect. A healthier, more inclusive company could inspire others to follow, to foster environments where respect is non-negotiable. The courage to stand against discrimination, he realized, was something anyone could carry, regardless of their title or position. He hoped his story would serve as a reminder that no matter how alone someone might feel, their worth isn't defined by the biases of others. Change starts with individuals who choose to confront injustice with resilience and self-respect. Jamal knew that small acts of integrity and fairness were what laid the groundwork for a more just world, one step at a time. To those who find themselves in similar struggles, Jamal's message was simple: stand firm, hold your ground, and never underestimate the strength of your own voice. By committing to equality, kindness, and respect, each of us can be part of a movement that transforms not only workplaces but communities, making the world a place where everyone has the chance to thrive.